Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about prohibition, so the end of prohibition, and how this ties into the beginning of the drug war and mass racially based incarceration. So I know what we think of is like drug war, mass incarceration, that's a modern issue. But the problem is it dates all the way back to the kind of early to mid 1900s. So this wasn't a 2000s or 1990s, 1980s problem. This is a 1900s period problem. So when we think of prohibition, so prohibition was the outlaw of alcohol. People thought, oh, if we get rid of alcohol, men won't be drunk, they won't waste their money, blah, 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 blah. They won't beat their wives, all these kinds of things. If you get rid of alcohol, all other crime will stop. Turns out that didn't work. In fact, crime shot up. You get things like the mafia rising and illegal moonshine running and alcohol running and all these kinds of things. So it actually funds all the other criminal enterprises and makes everything grow crazy. Then the Great Depression hits. And the government's like, oh crap. So when they prohibited alcohol, they lost something like 20 or 30% of their income from taxes on alcohol. So when the Great Depression's hitting, they're like, okay, if we get rid of prohibition, all that money is going to come back in. People haven't stopped drinking, they've just done it illegally. So now if we legalize it again, we'll bring all that money back in. And people were pretty stoked. So there's the 18th Amendment, the death of the 18th Amendment. Even cops and everybody else is handing out beer. Everyone is stoked to have alcohol back. No one really wanted it gone. I mean, clearly somebody wanted it gone because they voted for it. But apparently people regretted their decision very early on. So only a few years later, they end prohibition. Problem is, you have the Bureau of Prohibition that their whole job was to stop the illegal trade of alcohol. Problem is, alcohol is legal again. What is this whole department going to do? So they hastily try to find something that's bad enough, harmful enough to our society to make illegal. And then they could prohibit that substance. Well, what is that going to be? What is this crazy, harmful drug that is decimating the nation that must be stopped? They thought it was alcohol, but apparently it wasn't. So they got to find the true culprit, or at least something that can stand in for it. So they're going to choose weed, marijuana, cannabis. So this is the cannabis plant. And this is where we hear about CBD and THC and all these kinds of things today. And we're slowly having the legalization of marijuana across the United States. Now, cannabis is the name of the plant, also known as hemp. So hemp is the non-psychoactive version. Now, hemp was supposed to be the next big crop. So right around this time period, hemp was supposed to be the next big crop. It was made better paper, more durable paper, made better clothing, cheaper and more effective than cotton, all these kinds of things. But with the prohibition of marijuana, they prohibit hemp as well, and that gets wiped out up until recent history. So there's a lot of problems going into this. Now, why do they choose weed? Was it causing massive problems? Was it decimating the nation? Was it crazy addictive? No, none of these things. Marijuana up to this point had been pretty benign. No one else in the world had an issue with marijuana until the United States decided that we had an issue with marijuana. Now, why marijuana? And why even call it marijuana? So this is kind of how they described it at the time. Beware, young and old, people in all walks of life. This may be handed to you, so it's a little joint, by the friendly stranger. It contains the killer drug marijuana, a powerful narcotic in which lurks murder, insanity, and death. Warning, dope peddlers are shrewd. They may put some of this drug in your tea or in the tobacco cigarette. So on and so forth. Now, it is extremely rare for marijuana to have any kind of harmful effects. I'm not saying you should go smoke weed. I'm just saying the drug itself is unlikely to force you or trigger murderous, insane, or certainly not death. But there's a very clear reason why we choose marijuana and why they chose marijuana at this point in time. And it goes back to the name as well. So the name's cannabis, so that's the official name of the plant. But when the Bureau of Prohibition targets it, they call it marijuana. Now, marijuana was a slang term for cannabis used by Mexican Americans and Hispanic Americans across the southern portion of the United States. So why choose marijuana and not cannabis? Well, marijuana sounds Hispanic, and there's a lot of racist tendencies in the United States at this point in time, particularly against African Americans and Mexican Americans. Now, who were the primary users of marijuana? Surprise, surprise, Mexican Americans, African Americans were the primary people that partook in this. Now, it's going to change over the years. Everyone will start smoking. Basically, every racial group will have equal amount of smokers or consumers of marijuana or cannabis. But this shows a very clear decision. And we'll see this grow, and we'll talk about this in other videos in the class. But this is starting a very clear goal with this war on drugs. They don't call it a war on drugs technically until we get a little bit later in US history, but that's effectively what we're doing. We're choosing a drug, we're targeting the people that use that drug. Now, up to this point in US history, so up until the 1930s or so, when someone had a drug problem, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, opium, weed, whatever it was, whatever the drug of choice was, doctors tended to prefer kind of therapy, kind of help. So help the patient. After the Bureau of Prohibition begins targeting marijuana and then later other drugs, you have a shift in the American mindset. No longer are drug users or drug abusers victims. No longer should they receive help from friends, family, neighbors, government, all these kinds of things. Instead, they are vilified as evil people that have made a terrible choice. They're doing this to themselves. They deserve to be punished, not helped. Now, this is in 2007. So Washington, D.C., so Washingtonians, people who admitted to smoking marijuana, 12% of the population, or 12% of blacks admitted to it, and 10.5% of whites. So relatively the same number. People arrested for possession of marijuana. 91% of all arrests were black, 8% white. Now, there seems to be a skew of numbers. Shouldn't that be about 50-50? So you can see what was started in 1930s has created an institutionalized system. And we'll see this, in the 70s and 80s with the crack epidemic. Powder cocaine, which was used by white people, very low prosecution, and those that were prosecuted, low punishment rates. Crack cocaine, effectively the same drug in a different form, but used primarily by African Americans, extremely harsh punishment and a high conviction rate. So we see this time and time again. And this is what creates the institutionalized system. So even if we don't have slavery anymore, we have mass incarceration of primarily African and Mexican Americans. You do have white people in jails, of course, but the populations are always so disproportionate. You would think jails should reflect the populations in the United States. 60-70% white, 20-30% black, and so on down to the different populations. That's not the case. It's always overwhelmingly African Americans, then other groups, and then whites. Somehow whites make a majority of the population, yet the minority of the incarcerated. So we'll talk about this more as we go, but we got to understand there's a very clear connection from what was done at the beginning in 1930 to the way things are now and kind of the institutionalized kind of industry of prisons today. And I do call it an industry because these are private prisons making money from the government on keeping people in jail. They don't want to rehabilitate and get them out. They want to keep them in jail because that's their business. If everyone got rehabilitated and left, or if drugs were decriminalized, particularly drugs like marijuana, which make up the vast majority of incarcerations, then their business goes down. So that being said, we've got a lot to talk about. There's a whole lot in this that we could talk about for hours, but I'm just trying to lay out the kind of basics of what we're talking about. Your book covers some of this, but there's this arc that leads from where we're starting. So you have slavery, they outlaw that. Then you get Jim Crow and segregation. That slowly starts going away by the 1950s, 1960s. But in its place, you have mass incarceration of African Americans. We can't have slaves, but we can have prisoners. And we see this going time and time again. We see this today, even during the coronavirus, where prisoners are effectively forced to work for virtually no pay, $1 a day or whatever it is, to go work in these hospitals and different things to deal with corona patients. So this is a very shady thing, and this has happened time and time again, where these prisoners are used effectively as cheap slave labor. So I'll get off my soapbox for a minute. So we will stop there for today, and we'll pick up with more on these kind of topics and other stuff later. Y'all have a great day.